Tom Calder married Clara Hale on a Thursday for one reason, and the whole of Spear Valley knew it before the ink on the license had dried. He wanted the quarter section her dead father had left her, and he did not want her. He stood beside her at the front of the little plank church in a clean shirt he had not buttoned all the way to the throat, said the words, "A man says," and never once looked at her face while he said them, because he was looking past her at the deed. She was 29, which the valley called old for a bride, plain in the way working women go plain, with sun-browned hands and steady gray eyes and a way of standing very still that people mistook for having nothing inside. Her father had died owing the bank money the land could not cover, and a husband was the only thing standing between Clara Hale and the road, and so she had said yes to a man who wanted her like you want a fence post, for what it holds up. The valley made up its mind about the two of them in the time it takes to walk out of a church. Aldous Reams, who ran the biggest spread on the high range, and the Cattle Association besides, said it plain on the church steps to the men around him. Calder bought himself a dry hole and a spinster to keep house in it. He'll have the deed and a season of regret. His wife, Lavinia, laughed her small, contained laugh and called Clara the Hale girl, the way you'd name a stray, and old Pruitt from the feed store nodded along, because everyone knew Hale's bottom was scrub and willow and a creek that ran to dust by July, and everyone knew a man married a face, not 40 acres of dirt. What none of them knew, what Tom Calder himself did not know, riding home ahead of his new wife with the folded deed warm in his breast pocket, was that the old man had spent 30 years teaching his daughter exactly where the water in that valley really lived. Hale's bottom looked like nothing. That was the first thing, and for a long while it was the only thing the valley could see. The creek through it ran thin and brown and gave out by midsummer. The willows were scrub. The grass came up gray. Tom had wanted it for one cold reason. It sat square between his own dry lease and the road to the railhead, and owning it meant he could drive his cattle straight through instead of the long way round the Reams fence, and that was worth a wedding to him and nothing more. He moved Clara's few boxes into the low sod and timber house her father had built, took the good south room for himself, gave her the small north one without a word about it, and set about the work of a man who means to use a thing rather than love it. He was not cruel. That has to be said plain, because it matters later. He was a big, quiet man of about 34, scarred across one forearm from a wire fence, and harder things, widowed young, and gone shut as a closed gate ever since, and he treated Clara the way a careful man treats a stranger, boarding under his roof, civil, distant, present at supper, and gone by daylight. He had married the land. He had not married her, and he made sure she understood the difference. So Clara did what she had always done, which was work and watch and say very little about what she knew. She had grown up the only child of Eli Hale, a man other men called a fool for buying the worst-looking quarter in the valley when it was cheap, and she had spent her girlhood walking that ground at his side while he taught her the one thing he understood better than any man alive. Eli Hale could find water, not with a forked stick and a prayer, but with his eyes and his boots and 40 years of paying attention. The lean of the willows, the green that stayed green a week too long in a dry August, the brass surveyor's level he carried everywhere, and the little leather book he filled with the secret map of every seep and vein that ran beneath ground that looked, from a horse, like worthless dust. "The water doesn't go where the land tells you," he used to say, tapping the brass. "It goes where the land lies." He had left Clara two things when he died, the unpayable debt and that book. The valley counted the first, and never guessed the second. Clara kept the brass level wrapped in flannel at the bottom of her trunk in the small north room, the leather book beneath it, and on her third evening as a married woman she took them both out by lamplight and read her father's hand again, and understood, sitting in a house she had been given the smallest room in, that she alone in all of Spear Valley knew where the water was. And if you have ever been the quiet one in the room that everyone else had already counted out, looked past, talked over, married for what you could give and not for who you were, then you already know the particular straightness a person learns to stand with, and I think you already belong here. Take a moment and subscribe, because the people who sit with these stories are the ones who still believe the overlooked woman is the one worth choosing, and the hard-closed man is the one worth waiting on, and that the thing the whole valley calls worthless is usually the thing it cannot see. That is the only kind of love I tell here, and I am only at the beginning of telling this one. She did not announce what she knew. That was not her father's way, and it was not hers. Instead, she began, quietly, to work the land as a woman works who is in no hurry to be believed. She rose before Tom and was out in the gray, and where the willows leaned a certain way, she dug. Not a well, not yet, only a shallow sink lined with stone, the way Eli had shown her to catch and hold the seep that came up cool even in the dry. She moved a fence 2 posts east so the cattle would graze the green that the others could not explain. She let one low corner of the bottom go to a marsh the valley would have drained, because her father's book said a marsh is a bank that pays in August. Tom watched her go out and come in muddy to the elbow, and said nothing because he had married a fence post and did not expect it to have opinions about water. But he was a careful man, and careful men notice even when they have decided not to care. He noticed that the one stock pond on his new ground did not drop the way his own leased ponds dropped. He noticed the green in the low corner. He noticed, riding in one evening, his strange silent wife kneeling in the dirt with a brass instrument he did not recognize, sighting along it at nothing he could see, and he reined up and watched her a long moment, and then rode on and did not ask, because asking would have meant admitting she might know a thing he didn't. If you've made it this far into Clara's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The first crack in the gate came in the small things, the way it always does. A late frost took Tom's seed corn on the dry lease, and he came in grim, and found without a word, said that Clara had started a second flat of seedlings in the warm north window weeks before, on a hunch about the cold, and had enough to replant them both. He stood in the doorway of the small room he had given her, looking at the green crowding her windowsill, and something in his hard face moved once and went still. "You planted twice," he said. It was not quite a question. "My father planted 3 times," she said, not looking up, 2 for the frost and 1 for the fool who doubts the frost. And that was the first time in the whole of their marriage that Tom Calder almost smiled and caught it, and turned and went out to the barn. But he ate his supper that night across from her, instead of standing at the window with his plate, and he did not seem to notice he had done it. And Clara, who noticed everything, said not one word about it, and only passed him the bread. The valley went on sneering, because the valley could not see the north window. Aldous Reams made it his particular sport, the way a big man will pick a small target to feel large. He had wanted Hale's Bottom himself, in truth, for its road frontage, and losing it to a man like Calder galled him. So at the Cattle Association meeting in town, he said, loud enough for Clara to hear it through the open mercantile door where she was buying thread, that he'd give Calder till the dry to come crawling to lease Reams' water, him and his dirt-grubbing wife both. Lavinia Reams told the other wives that the Hale girl had been seen on her knees in a marsh like a creature, and the word went round that Clara Calder had gone strange out there talking to willows. Clara bought her thread and walked out past the laughing men, with her chin level and her back straight, and carried the shame home folded small, the way she carried everything, and did not tell Tom, because telling him would have meant needing him, and she had learned a long time ago not to need. The brass level rode in her apron pocket that day. She took it out on the wagon seat where no one could see, and held it the way you hold the last true thing you own. Then the rains did not come. They were 3 weeks late, and then they were a month. And then the old men stopped saying, "Any day now," and started looking at the sky the way you look at a sick animal. The creek through Hale's Bottom went to a string of warm puddles. The grass on the high range cured to brown standing hay, and then to dust, and the wind took the dust. And by the back end of July, Spear Valley was in a drought the like of which the oldest settler could not match against any year he'd lived. Reams's great herd, that he had grazed too hard on too little, began to gaunt and bawl along the dry coulees. Pruitt's garden died. The shallow leased ponds Tom depended on for his own cattle shrank to cracked gray rings, and Tom Calder, who had married 40 acres of dirt to drive his cattle through, stood at the edge of his best pond one morning and watched it die, and understood that the dirt was about to cost him everything he had. He came back to the house gut-sick and quiet, and Clara, who had been watching the sky longer and harder than any of them, and had been making ready in her silent way for weeks, set down the pail she carried and said the longest run of words she had said to him in their whole marriage. "There's water on this place," she said. "There's been water on this place the whole time. My father found it 20 years ago, and I know where every foot of it lies. I did not tell you because you did not ask me, and because a man who marries a deed does not believe the deed can save his life. But your cattle are going to die, Tom, and mine are not, and I would rather we save them together. Come and see." For a moment she thought he would not. Pride is the last thing a hard man sets down. He looked at her standing there in her father's land with her father's brass level in her apron, and the whole valley's laughter was in his ears, a dry hole and a spinster. And against all of it was the plain fact of his dying herd, and at last, and this was the bravest thing she ever saw him do, he set the pride down. "Show me," he said. So she showed him. She took him first to the low marsh corner the valley had laughed at, and dug down through the dark soil to where the water stood cool and steady a foot under, a buried lens her father's book had mapped, fed by a vein that ran on through the dry. She took him to the willow lean and the stone-lined sink already brimming where she had opened the seep months back against this exact summer while he had watched and not asked. She unrolled on the tailgate of the wagon the secret map of Spear Valley her father had made. Every sink, every vein, every cool hollow, a whole hidden country of water under the worthless-looking dust. And she put her finger on the place, high on his own dry lease, where Eli Hale had written that a strong vein ran shallow not 40 feet from where Tom's best pond was even now dying on the wrong side of a rise, where no one would ever think to dig. And it was reading her dead father's hand on that map, kneeling in the dust with this strange, brave wife of his, that Tom Calder finally understood the size of the thing he had married for the wrong reason and been handed anyway. Eli Hale had spent 30 years building a map to save a valley that called him a fool, and had left it to a daughter the same valley called nothing, and that daughter had spent the worst summer in living memory, quietly making the land ready to do exactly this for a husband who had given her the smallest room in her own house and never once asked her name for water. The letter at the front of the book was short. "To whoever works this ground when I am gone," Eli had written, "the water is here, it was always here, you have only to be the kind of person who looks. My Clara looks. Trust her over the rain." Tom read it twice. Then he folded it back into the book with a care his hands did not usually have, and looked at his wife for what may have been the first time, and what he said was only, "Where do we dig first?" They dug together. There was no time for anything else, and after a while there was no wish for anything else. He brought the team and the slip scraper and his own hard back, and she brought the brass level and the map and the certainty, and they opened the vein on the high lease first, because his cattle were nearest to dying, and when the water came up cold and clean into the cut a full day's work later, Tom Calder knelt down in the mud and put his whole hand into it and laughed once, a sound she had never heard him make. And then he looked up at her, standing over him against the brown burning sky, and the look on his face was not a man looking at a deed. They ran the water to his dying pond, and it filled. They opened the marsh lens for the home herd, and it held. Word that there was live water at Hale's Bottom in the middle of the worst drought in 50 years went up the valley like fire goes up dry grass. And the first man down the road to see it for himself was Aldous Reams. He came stiff in the saddle with his great herd gaunting behind him and his pride a stone in his throat, and he sat his horse at the edge of the running cut and looked at the cold water moving through ground he had called a dry hole, and at the plain woman he had called the Hale girl standing easy beside it with a brass instrument in her hand, and the valley that had ridden down behind him to watch went very quiet. He did not say he was sorry. Men like Reams rarely do. But he took his hat off, to her, not to Tom, and he asked, in a voice gone humble, as a man like that ever gets, whether there might be water enough to lease for a herd that would otherwise die. And Clara Calder, who had carried his laughter home folded small a dozen times, looked at the man a long quiet moment and did not gloat, and did not refuse. "My father would have shared it," she said. "He always said, 'Water you keep to yourself goes bad. Bring your cattle to the low cut. There's enough.'" And there was. There was enough for the Reams herd, and Pruitt's last milk cow, and the little outfits at the dry end of the valley that no one ever counted, because Eli Hale had mapped a country of water, and his daughter had spent a marriage learning to open it, and the only thing the valley had ever lacked was the eyes to see what it called worthless. Lavinia Reams brought a cake to the door, which is the nearest a woman like that comes to an apology, and the wives who had laughed about the marsh came to fill their barrels and stayed to thank her. And old Pruitt told anyone who would listen that he'd known the Hale ground was special all along, which was a lie, and Clara let him have it, because being proven right in front of people who once laughed is a quieter pleasure than the laughers will ever understand. Nobody hurried her into anything after that. That was the thing she noticed most. Having stood on her own ground and been seen on it at last, she was simply, finally, let be. The marriage that had started as a transaction became a marriage the way the water had come up, slowly, from underneath, from a source that had been there the whole time. There was no grand speech. There was an evening weeks on, the drought broken at last, and the first true rain drumming the sod roof, when Tom came in wet and stood a while by the stove where she was working, and said, plain as he said everything, "I married you for the land." A pause. "I'd not have you stay for that. Stay because I'd be a poor fool without you. That's the whole of it." And he set on the table between them the folded deed to Hale's Bottom, the thing he had wanted, the only thing he had wanted, and he pushed it across to her side and left his hand off it. "It was always yours," he said. "I just took a long, stupid summer to want the rest of you more." Clara looked at the deed and then at the man, and she did not pick the deed up. Instead, she reached into her apron and set her father's brass level down beside it, the two of them together on the scrubbed wood, the thing the valley valued and the thing that had actually saved it. And she said only, "Then we'll work it together." And Tom closed his scarred hand over hers and over the cool brass, and neither of them said anything more, because everything that needed saying had finally been said. The rain came down on Hale's Bottom that the valley had called a dry hole, and the creek that had gone to dust ran full and brown and loud in the dark, and neither of them got up to do a single thing about it for a long while. By the next spring the bottom was the green heart of Spear Valley, and the woman Aldous Reams had called Nothing was the one every outfit in the country came to when they wanted to know where to dig. Clara walked the ground each morning the way her father had, the brass level in her apron and the leather book in her hand, and Tom walked it beside her now instead of ahead, and the stone-lined sinks she had opened in the worst of the dry-brimmed cool through the next dry without fail. The deed to the bottom hung framed on the wall of the house, in her name and his both, though neither of them thought about it much. It was only paper, and paper had never once told the truth about that land. What told the truth was the water, and the water answered to one person in the whole valley, and the valley knew her name now and used it. She never did tell Tom how often, in that first cold, married winter, she had thought of pawning the brass level to clear a little of the debt and run. Some things you carry without ever naming them. The land had taught her that, and her father had taught her that, and now the hard, quiet man who had married her for 40 acres and stayed for the whole of her had learned it too. Standing in cold water, he would have died beside out of pure pride if a plain woman with steady gray eyes had not known the secret country underneath. They say a man can ride past the most valuable thing in the valley his whole life and call it a dry hole simply because he never learned to see what lies under what looks like nothing. And Aldous Reams rode past Clara Hale for 30 years before a drought taught him to take off his hat. So here is what I will leave you with tonight. When the thing the whole world has written off as worthless turns out to be the only thing that can save it, do you keep what it gives you and walk away the richer? Or do you stay and learn at last to love what you were too proud to look at? Tell me which one you are. And that was tonight's story from the Hearth and Homestead. If it warmed you, pull your chair up again soon.